symptoms.
What are you doing, Professor? the class is going to be only like 3 people. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Professor. Today's Friday, Professor.
Good. Good. I like Fridays. I like Fridays a lot better than Mondays. All right. That's oh, there we go. Okay, good morning. I'm going to go over there's probably some confusion about what you guys are supposed to do. So I'm just going to very quickly walk through what I see. This is the Canvas. This is my version of our Canvas site. I assume the student view is somewhat similar, might be not so complicated. Key thing here to remember is that there's sort of two types of modules we have. We have some modules that look like this, and this is where the confusion came up. I can't remember, someone was asking me a question about, do we have to do X? Some of the modules are actually thinking skills that are for your personal use. And if you notice, there's no grades attached to that. Other modules are the actual class material. And those are your critical thinking exercises. You notice it's got points attached to it. There's just something to remember for every class. If you're any of your classes, if there's points attached to it, it's something you have to do. Because that's actually tied into the syllabus, that's tied into the grading sheet that's part of Canvas, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's points, do it. If there's not points, for example, this particular thing on Hawaiian agriculture, I would recommend it. You should do it. You might find it useful for example, some folks did this for part of their critical thinking exercise. But that's just more for informational purposes. It's there if you want it. But anytime you see critical thinking exercise, and if it has points attached to it, those are points that go towards the 100 points that are your course grade. And this is true of any course you take. That's the way Canvas is set up. If you're in doubt, do it. If you're not sure, then as a couple of folks did ask me, and I'll clarify it. But my unfortunate, my confusion was I thought folks were asking about these particular sets of modules, which are actually just skills for you to learn. They're to help you get ahead educationally, but they're not part of the course material. So therefore, there are no grades and there are no critical thinking exercises attached to these guys, only to the material we're covering as part of this semester. Since there was some confusion, exercise 2, I need to have that by Monday, that's the 12th. Exercise 3 is still due when it was due, which is the 16th. So that's, then you're, if you got behind because you thought you didn't have to do something, then you're back on schedule. If so we go through these, there's the exercises always have points attached to them. So, this is true of every class in Canvas. It's the way Canvas is structured. So in any class, if you're not sure, and this especially would be true of a totally online class, if there's points attached to it, always default and do the work. If you don't do it, then there's going to be a 0 attached automatically in Canvas to that part of the grade. So, so if there's some confusion, I apologize, but that's the way it is. Critical thinking exercises are your main grades in this class. You're doing those instead of midterms and final exams or quizzes. So the critical thinking exercise is what you get graded on. You don't do them and you fail the class. You don't do them because you're not doing anything. There's no way for me to assess if you're actually paying any attention or doing anything in class. So just to get that sort of unconfused, hopefully. Are there any questions about that? Okay, I guess not. Okay. Okay, so from that, let's segue into what I want to actually try. I don't think I'll probably won't be able to finish up on the Big Island today. Some of the stuff we're going to look at the Big Island actually is part of an issue that occurs on other islands. It's just that we're doing the Big Island first for unique islands. So some of the stuff will apply to other places also. I sort of ended up last time with this whole issue of with the interest that everyone had, which was on the volcano, is that sort of in a rather strange way, Hilo ends up being the center point for commerce, traffic, and everything else vis-a-vis the Big Island. And so what happens is, just as I think I mentioned last time, you sort of have this line between Hilo and the volcano, and everything else in the Big Island just sort of, is like a satellite. It's sort of like a periphery of that. In the territorial period, where this has already been defined, territories by definition have to run on the cheap. They're not states. They don't have the same access to tax resources. They're entirely at the mercy of the U.S. Congress, for example. So territories always are short of money. So in that situation, given the fact that all the locus of power and authority and everything here was in Honolulu, that was where the monarchy was, that's where the republic was, that's where the territorial government was, that's where the territorial legislature was, that's where all the big businesses were, all the banks and everything were, where they still are, down on Bishop Street. So all the money, all the focus, all the power and everything else was in Honolulu. In fact, you could sort of say it was the territory of Honolulu versus the territory of Hawaii. And in fact, if you go to the other islands, even today, they'll oftentimes talk about the state of Oahu versus the state of Hawaii, just because that's the way that it seems to happen here. In that context, there was very little interest in the Big Island. It financially or economically was sort of off the chart. It was sort of a notorious tourist destination to go see a volcano. But a volcano isn't people. A volcano is a volcano. It's a physical object. So the Big Island was pretty much seen as, if you wanted to get away to the country, you go to the Big Island. And so the territory was going to spend as little as money as possible on infrastructure, as I mentioned last time, or anything else in the Big Island, just because they didn't see, one, there was a lot of people there, so it wasn't worth the investment. And two, it's so far away and it's so out of sight, out of mind. Given the fact that all the interest is in Honolulu or Oahu, that they were just going to spend pennies if they can get away with it. So any money that was invested in Hilo. So you make a harbor in Hilo that's more safe. You don't make harbors, a little bit of Kauai, but you really don't make any harbors in the rest of that, which you could have done. So you spend what little money you're going to spend in Hilo. You build an airport, you only build one, you build it in Hilo. And so what happens is the rest of the island, this sort of focus on Hilo and the rest of the island just sort of like smoke, gets constantly reinforced over the decades. Any money that comes in goes to Hilo. Anyone that goes to visit the island goes to Hilo. And so what happens is Hilo becomes the center. And the odd thing, of course, was in all the period prior to that, Hilo didn't exist. Hilo was never the center of the island of Oahu, the Big Island. The Big Island center was either in Kohala or it was in Kona. So right into the 1830s, the entire locus of power was to the north or the west, and all of a sudden, after the 1830s, it's this pretty strange little place in the far end of nowhere called Hilo. And if you're the forces that control most of the Big Island, especially like Parker Ranch, you don't necessarily mind that. Ranches aren't big on tourists. There's not a lot that tourists have to offer them. Tourists are a real drain on their resources. They have tourists getting run over by cattle, or it's just sort of a bad idea. So your economic forces in the Big Island, which were largely ranching, and by the early mid 20th century would be coffee over in the Kona area. Neither of those are of tourist interest. Neither of those had anything to show tourists. And the Big Island, by virtue of the distance and the bad roads and everything else, it was very hard for tourists to get around. And so there was nothing really marketed in terms of the places you should go if you're a tourist. So rather than that, what you got is the Big Island was marketed as the empty island. So you marketed folks, you could go to Hilo, and if you spent a couple of days in Hilo, you could go to mysterious areas like Puna, say Pahoa. You could go down to Na'alehu, you could go down to South Point. You could go to these places where no one ever goes. So you're not marketing the island for the people, or even to a certain extent what's there. You're marketing the island because it's empty. In the same way that parts of Nevada are still marketed today. So what you get is that becomes one of the connotations. The second part is because of the tourist fascination with the volcano, is what happens is the myriad of Hawaiian gods that existed, if you remember when we were talking earlier in the semester about all this, they pretty much all disappeared with the exception of one. So what happens is in an island that had a number, Kamapuaa was a big thing in Kohala. There were a number of gods. There were the shark gods on the northwest coast. So there were a number of ancestor gods that were on the Big Island, and for some of the families there, they still are. But the only one that remains in popular memory and sort of popular mythos and becomes an urban legend to a certain extent is Pele. So to a certain extent, by the 1920s, you start to see people talking about Pele's Island as like a synonym for the Big Island. And you start to see this more and more, this sort of ramped up discussion where everything becomes Pele, which in a weird way sort of makes sense, because if the only reason anyone remembers the Big Island is because of the volcano, and they tie the volcano to Pele, then it makes sense that the whole island would be, quote, hers, unquote. And so what you end up is a sort of odd situation that one of the number of Hawaiian ancestor, sort of God figures, becomes sort of the last one standing. Even today, almost everyone in the Hawaiian Islands recognizes the name Pele. Very few folks in the Hawaiian Islands, even if they're part Hawaiian, recognize the, Kia Wahine. A few more might recognize Hi'iaka. Kamapua'a, maybe, but again, there'll be particular places and particular groups. So what happens is one of a number of figures becomes vaulted into sort of a new situation where she becomes the new sort of archetype for the world of nature. And if you remember that Violent Hawaii, or whatever the hell that video was we saw watched earlier in the semester, there's constantly this discussion, sort of Pele sort of chucked out there as this new sort of 20th, 21st century goddess in a neo-Hawaiian context. So what you have is the original Hawaiian view of her, or markedly it, I suppose. And then what you have is the sort of modern context, which is constantly reiterated every time there's an eruption or anything like that in terms of Pele this and Pele that. Can't mess with Pele, don't touch anything that Pele did. All these sort of different things, and they all involve her, but not in the context of traditional Hawaiian belief, in the context of sort of modern spins on what this is. So to a certain extent, Pele, volcano, and nature become sort of synonymous. And that's something you see a lot today. It's a very large part of the marketing of the Big Island in a rather odd way. Now, what this also means is despite the fact that inter-island steamers are a big thing, 19th to 20th century, air travel starts up in the early 1920s. The Big Island is pretty much off the chart for that for a very simple reason. If you look at your early, well, even into the 1950s, the type of planes that you use, like the DC-3s used to still be able to see flying to Molokai, it's very difficult for those planes to fly from Oahu to the Big Island because of the distance. It was really far, and it took about, I think in a DC-3, it would probably take you about 3 or probably 4 hours to get to the Big Island, because they don't go very fast. They're only like 100 miles an hour. So what happened is the Big Island, even with air travel, doesn't really become more included into the idea of the Hawaiian travel or tourism experience. It's still the empty island. It's still the place you have to make a special effort to get to. And, at some point, unlike Kauai, they never really marketed that. They never marketed the idea that you were, going to some place that was really the true Polynesian untouched place, which Kauai is very, for whatever set of reasons, has managed to sort of, spin that logic. Big Island never does, and I'm not sure why particularly, but it just doesn't happen. So what you find is, ironically, air travel actually starts up in the 1970s when they build the Hilo International Airport, and that was largely for air freight. Originally for meat, and then later for all the other, like macadamia nuts, coffee, etc. Those of you that are familiar with it, but if you go back in time, in fact, I'm sure it shows up if you Google it. The Hilo International Airport is actually built on Hawaiian homes land. The state actually takes land that's set aside for Hawaiian homes, turns it into an airport, saying, well, the public needs it more than Hawaiian homes needs it. There's still a huge thing going on. I don't know whether the state ever reimbursed Hawaiian homes for this. So this went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Hawaiian homes won. So I don't know whatever the final decision of that was. But this was very typical that you could do stuff like that on the Big Island, because the Big Island was so far away from anyone's interest that if you were the state or some other large landowner, you could pretty much do what you wanted to, just like you could in the 19th century, but you could still do it into the latter half of the 20th century, because basically no one in Honolulu cared, and Honolulu was where everything important happened. So basically the situation in the Big Island is that it's an economic place. It's a place where you have agriculture or animals, and so you're selling meat and stuff like that. So it's basically, if you would, a food basket that generates stuff for other islands and other places, but it's not a place that people went to experience as tourists, with the exception of the volcano. Now, one of the reasons this, not surprisingly, is that if you're familiar with Hilo, it makes an absolutely lousy tourist destination. Because tourism in Hawaii is tied to the there's the five, I always forget the fifth, what we call the 5 S's. And if you think of the Mauna Kea Resort on the Big Island, if you think of even Ko'olina in the 21st century, Kaanapali, you have to have these 5 things, and they're sun. So you have to have sun about 280 to 300 plus days of the year. So any tourist coming to the island that goes to that resort can be guaranteed there'll be sunny, it'll be sunny out, and then go to the beach and get sunburned. You have to have surf, you have to have moving water. Not 10, 20-foot waves, but you have to have little bits of moving water, so you have the sound of water, which reminds people they're in quote paradise or Eden unquote. You have to have sand. This is something that's oftentimes forgotten about. You have to have sand, and it has to be sand that people can sit on. It can't be rocks, it can't be hard coral, it can't be other stuff. It can be black sand, but it has to be sand. This is something a lot of places in the world don't have. In Europe, for example, most of your beaches are made of rock, they're pebbles. And people get, it's no fun to walk on. So you have to have sand. It has to have the appearance of clean sand, so you don't want sand mixed with mud. That immediately puts all sorts of places off the mark, and that includes Hilo. Most of the sand in Hilo has dirt coming down from the river that spills over into it. So on one hand, it's a good hard pan sand if you're canoeing, for example, but it's not the type of place that tourists would want to sit because it looks like it's dirty. You have this sort of personification of sex, a romantic sexuality, which again is a huge part of the sort of Polynesian ethos that the Europeans spin. It becomes a huge part of the tourism experience in Hawaii in the past, still is today. And then of course you have the idea of sunset. You have the idea that you can see horizons, you have sunrises and sunsets, and that people can experience these. All these require that basically have clear weather. And the problem with Hilo, of course, is it's on the windward side of the island. So Hilo gets rain, and it usually gets it between 9:40 and about 10:55 in the morning, and usually once again in the afternoon. So Hilo has a lot of clouds. Hilo has a fair amount of rain. It's fairly humid there, and it gets pretty hot there. And if it doesn't do that, it has wind. So it only gets about 2 out of 5 of the 5 things you have to fulfill the Hawaii tourism experience. So even though they build a number of hotels in Hilo, the state invested an enormous amount of money trying to set Hilo up as a tourist destination. Why, I don't understand. Even at the time, people could have told them it was a bad idea. This is why you end up with like a Naniloa Surf and places like that. They build these big hotels are built. The state encourages them, provides partial funding, with the idea that the Big Island needs a tourism experience, and of course it's going to be Hilo. And the end result is it goes absolutely thump. It was handy when I did work back in the mid-'70s because you could go get a room, and if we're doing work down in Pahoa, you could just the rooms were cheap. Why? Because the hotels were empty all the time. So Hilo fails as a tourist destination, and it never fulfilled the basic criteria that even Waikiki does. So the odd thing about that is, of course, you have at the same time that the state's investing enormous amounts of money over here, is by that time you already have the Mauna Kea Hotel being built up here, which does fit the 5 S's. And so this whole side of the island is generally sunny for 280 days of the year. There's a fair number of beaches depending on where you are. There's actually pretty low surf on this side because you're pretty much on the lee side of the island. So the very thing that keeps sailing ships away, in 1800 was actually a positive for the tourism experience of the 20th, 21st century. But for some reason, the state, which had become so focused on the idea that everything has to happen in Hilo because that's the county capital, that's where the quote people are, that's where the quote money is, that they keep on pouring money into a place that really has no particularly good reason for its existence as the capital of the county. And the side effect of that is they then put no investment monies in the whole rest of the island. So the rest of the island, and this was true right into the 1990s, we did a ton of work over in Kailua Kona area in the 70s and early 80s, my company did. And all that money was private. The county was vaguely involved in sort of giving permits, but what you have are these massive private developments, not the least of which would be the huge Keoho development that Kamehameha Schools built. So the private sector went in and built this part of the island up, and then pretty much demanded that the county and the state do something about it. But it says something that, for example, the saddle road wasn't improved till about 10 years ago, even though it was in crappy shape since the 1960s. So what you had was the investment attitude and the perception of the state of Hawaii from the capital in Honolulu was that the only place of any relevance was Hilo, and the rest of the island was just, irrelevant. And that had some odd side effects, because what that meant is if you're the private sector, you could pretty much do what you wanted to in the Big Island, and there was no sense of control because the state wasn't going to care. The county basically was powerless. So you ended up with a bunch of people doing stuff that was really sketchy in terms of the legality of it. Things like putting up hotels where they didn't have permits, moving burials around all over the place, which the Kehoe development was famous for. There's still 3 developments in the Big Island that have been in lawsuits since the 1990s for illegal development. 2 of them got stopped. The other one keeps on sort of stopping. Something that would never happen on the other islands, but happens on the Big Island, and still, to a certain extent, is going on as we speak in 2020. So what you get is on one hand, the state gets fascinated with this place. All the money very quickly shifts over to this side of the island. Now a third thing kicks in, and this really sort of changes the entire balance of power. And it's sort of an odd thing because it has nothing to do with the Hawaiian Islands per se, in the sense it's nothing we started. Switch over here. So if it's now 1980, and I first heard about this in the 1980s. We'll just say arbitrary, that's a good date. So the state sees the world, the Big Island world, as being here. The investment money is already pretty much seen the money, and tourism is entirely here. And so in that context, you've got the island sort of splits into 2 parts. Now, if you think of these as like 2 sides of a sandwich, the chunk in the middle is the ranches. And the biggest one was Parker Ranch, which is based here. Whoops, come on, babies, wake up. Well, the system definitely has decided it's Friday day. So the ranches are pretty much this slightly green section, if you would, of the Big Island. And eventually when this wakes up, come on, babes, you can do it. It's Friday. We can wake up. Anyways, so what you've got is Parker Ranch, which pretty much controlled everything up here, all the way down through here. And they were one of 6 large ranches that pretty much controlled everything from this side here, all the way down to here. They didn't control the shoreline, but all your sort of upcountry area from here is all run by 6 major ranches. And they had a lot of cattle, and they made a lot of money. And ironically, in the early 1980s, they started to make a lot of money because it was sort of the first part of this, what you might call, what do they call it today, farm to table. And Parker Ranch was the lead in this, along with Ulupulakua and Halakala and Maui. What they started to realize is that with the movement of places like Safeways and other mainland grocery store chains into the Hawaiian Islands, which had not happened to that. Prior to that, all the grocery store chains were locally owned. Foodland was the Sullivans. I can't remember who started, what the family was, Times. All these were locally owned. Markets, KTA, were all locally owned grocery store chains. In the 70s, early 80s, the mainland starts to move in. And so to remain competitive, what happens is the local stores start buying more mainland products and having them shipped in. So one of the things that happens to is meat. More and more what you find very quickly is, given the scale, is that mainland steak, mainland hamburger and stuff like that was a hell of a lot cheaper to purchase than stuff grown locally or raised locally. So since they can't compete on a price basis, what happens is the ranches very cleverly decide that what they're going to do is they're going to market the fact that it's local. So what they do is they start marketing the made in Hawaii part, the local grass-fed, which is true. I mean, they're grass-fed because you can't get these cattle into spots where you're going to feed them. The buggers just run all over the place. So and actually this happened, you guys are probably most familiar with like Redondo's. So sausage, anything to do with meat products, pretty much they start advertising made in Hawaii versus shipped in from the mainland. Now I have to remember this is pre-GMO and a lot of those sort of worries were just sort of hadn't happened yet. But they were actually doing quite well. In fact, the ironic thing was the ranches were actually doing really well shipping meat products in sealed containers to the mainland because the meat tasted better. So what they were doing is they were actually starting to make a pretty good killing on the West Coast. For example, Parker Ranch was making a lot of money selling frozen steak and some sort of sealed type of hamburger. I mean, I remember it was in a tube. To West Coast upscale markets. So they were starting to really make inroads into the market industry or the meat industry. And what happened is between them and a bunch of other things, the huge consortiums of meat producers in the US mainland, which is Tyson, I can't remember the other 2. There's only 3 companies that basically produce about 90% of the meat that you eat in the United States. It's all 3 huge consortiums. They went to the federal government in the early 1980s and proposed to the federal government, along with a lot of donations to people, that having meat producing facilities in all parts of the United States was unsanitary. That it would have made more sense and it was going to save the government money if you only had these absolutely massive meat slaughterhouses in certain parts of the United States. So that's where your FDA, your food inspectors could be at those particular locations. You wouldn't have to have as many inspectors. You'd have fewer places to check, so therefore they could be more sanitary. It was a totally half-assed argument that was entirely blatantly due to the fact it would be them who would solely benefit. It would cut the meat producers in Montana and Wyoming out, Oregon, Washington State, all the sort of mid-scale ranchers, Texas, who are making money selling their local meat would suddenly find themselves aced out because no longer they could no longer legally sell it in the United States because it has to be approved by the FDA. For some reason, I suspect it's entirely money. This bill was passed. The U.S. Congress passes this, and all of a sudden, what happens here in Hawaii is these slaughterhouses close. So if you're Parker Ranch, literally one morning, you cannot turn your cows into steaks and hamburgers anymore unless you want to put them in a 747 airplane and fly them to Nevada to be slaughtered. Which by the time you figure out what's it going to cost to ship a cow from here to Nevada, I don't care what you charge for that meat, you're not going to get your money back. So what happened is this game that was being played on the U.S. mainland by your, huge sort of, food consortiums, just completely, Tyson Hormel, completely wiped out small and mid-scale ranching in almost all the United States. It had an enormous impact on the big end because they were just in the process, ironically, of starting to make a nice amount of money out of ranches. The ranches were thinking of expanding. They were starting to increase the number of cattle they had. They were making good money for probably the first time in 60 or 70 years. And literally in the space of less than 5 years, there's like this massive, freeway train wreck. And all of a sudden the whole thing just fell apart. Tons of people went bankrupt all across the United States, especially in rural, ranching areas. Wyoming, Montana pretty much completely fell off the charts. Texas ranches went under by the dozen. And the ranches here pretty much went under by the dozen with a few exceptions, because all of a sudden you could not sell your meat. You could only if you were part of one of these three enormous companies. Now, of course, you guys are probably familiar with it because these guys invariably get cited all the time because these enormous meat packing facilities are highly unsanitary, very risky, and invariably get caught up in all sorts of really sort of nightmare situations with all sorts of bacterial spread, et cetera, because of all the meat being produced in huge amounts in very small places, which is an incredibly bad idea. Everyone knew that back in the 80s. But they were able to get this to happen, and now they've got so much power. If you were to go and reverse that trend, I don't know if you could, because these folks are worth so much money and they control so much of the meat production. I think they would just threaten to shut meat production down, and all of a sudden Americans wouldn't have hamburger anymore. And to be honest, if I'm a small scale rancher, why would I trust the federal government? You guys screwed us over in the 1980s. Why would I think now is going to be any different? So federal regulations wiped out the ranching industry here in Hawaii. And the Big Island took it on the chin. Maui did almost as bad, but the Big Island was absolutely hammered because the whole center part of the island was devoted to ranching. So all of a sudden, the other big economic drive, which was actually at the time bigger than tourism, just literally ceased to exist by virtue of the stroke of a pen in the U.S. Congress, and it just literally destroyed, animal, production here in the Hawaiian Islands. I should point out this isn't just cattle. This is also any type of meat. So chickens, et cetera, same thing. So what happens is the ranching industry collapses. And if you think about it, if you're a ranch, you are well and truly reamed if all of a sudden you can't sell your cattle, because that's the whole reason you're there. The place is designed for cattle. Your guys, that's what they do. They work and they know cattle. That's what you know how to do. In the case of Parker Ranch, the Smart family owned it, but Parker Ranch in one form or another had been around since like 1836. Ulapalakua Ranch was around from 1842. So you have, by the 1980s, you have what, 140 years of experience doing something, and all of a sudden, for some reason, 7,000, 8,000 miles away, they just decide, and it just stops. It doesn't get much press now, but it was probably one of the biggest economic shatters in Hawaiian history, at least in the historic period. Sugar collapses in a long period of time. Different places go out of sugar over the space of about 50 years. Ranching collapses in 6 months. And no one's at all interested in finding alternatives or what are you going to do. So all of a sudden, if you're Park or Ranch, you're the single largest landowner on the Big Island. You're one of the largest ranches in the United States. And all of a sudden, everything that you raise and everything you do isn't worth a penny. And that happens to you. It's nothing you did. It's not like suddenly people stopped eating meat. No, it's not like everyone became vegan. It's literally because the federal government, due to lobbying, suddenly decides that your existence isn't relevant and shuts you down. At that point, you don't have any reason to exist anymore. So when that happens, the Big Island just goes into an absolute economic collapse. The economy just does a nosedive. And at that point, you then have several factors coming in. Money's starting to show up here. So whereas unlike the other islands, the Big Island was pretty ambivalent about tourism. Tourism was very much a niche market in particular locations. But a lot of what people actually did was tied to ranching and other stuff, which was making money, which is ironically because it was part of this whole sort of sustainable initiative that's now such a big thing in 2020 with the state. Well, the Big Island was doing that pretty successfully in, say, 1980. But then all of a sudden, when you shut this down as an industry, you're suddenly the only thing you're left with any way to make any money is either growing coffee down here, which doesn't require very many people, and you actually can't use this land to grow coffee. It's not right. That's not the right type of climate. Or it's tourism. And of course, this area is no good for tourism because it's the wrong climate. It's too cool up here. It's too far from the ocean. It doesn't have any of the 5 S's. So like Hilo, all of a sudden, everything except this strip on this coastline largely becomes irrelevant economically. And all of a sudden, if you're the Big Island, you have to deal with it because as with the other islands, if you're not Oahu, the state legislature doesn't care what happens to other islands. It's entirely focused on what happens on Oahu. So if you're the Big Island and you're the mayor or the county council and you go to the state and you say, we need help, we're in real trouble because we're really just getting reamed by this and we don't know what to do about it. The state's going to look at you and say, well, we all got problems. You have this problem, Oahu needs another freeway. Between the two things, Oahu's going to get it because Oahu has a lot more people than you do, and they're more visible and we can hear them all the time because they come and march in front of the state capitol. You guys are 800 miles away. So what happens is there's all sorts of different attempts to try to provide alternatives. There have been a bunch of attempts starting when this collapse occurs of sort of ecotourism. Park and Ranch does several initiatives to try to get people to ride horses and discover the volcanoes by horseback. And all sorts of stuff like that might have worked in maybe another situation for a few people. But to be honest, there's not many tourists that want to ride a horse. There's not very many tourists that want to ride a horse after you've been on a horse for 30 minutes, if you're familiar with riding horses. And it's just, they want something that requires a very low threshold of skill. They want something they can do really quickly, so it has to take about 30 minutes. And they want it to be sort of exciting. And to be honest, riding a horse, I've had to use horses all over the time. Horses aren't interesting. Horses are just a really slow way of getting around. And so what happens is there's no way to convert this huge part of this island into anything else that really makes any sense to make money if it involves the word tourist in it. So the tourism industry pretty much stays and still is along that narrow band of the West Coast, and the rest of the island just sort of completely off the charts. And ever since then, your only other power that you have in terms of money is the military use of Pohakuloa, which expands after Kaho'olawi's given back to the state. Because at that point, then Pohakuloa becomes the only other place where you can do live fire training to any huge extent. You can use little stuff at places like Makua, but you can't use the big booms because it scares the bejesus out of everyone. So Pohakuloa becomes the place the military uses. They're spending some money there, but it doesn't really involve a lot of troops. So what that means is not a lot of civilian jobs there. And of course, the military doesn't have to pay state taxes. So the state and the county really make almost nothing off the military use of Pohakuloa. So what you end up with is an island that is dependent on tourism almost entirely. But it's the late part of tourism, the 1980s, 1990s terms. So enclave tourism, there's really no other economic engine that drives the island. And so, it pretty much just becomes this one, one trick pony. And this is why, for example, the Merry Monarch is such an absolute critical thing. That's the only thing that generates money for Hilo. It's the only time the hotels are full is during Merry Monarch. So what you can have is you can have these events that become escalated. I remember Merry Monarch back in the 70s was done in a gym. It involved largely Big Island and a couple of halals from Maui and stuff like that. But it was a local thing. TV gets into it. The state starts hugely promoting it through the Hawaii Tourism Authority because they're trying to find ways to make tourism happen in the Big Island, and they're really trying to figure out some way to drive tourists to Hilo, which is otherwise a failure. So, so that becomes why Merry Monarch turns into what it is today. It's a huge thing. And that's because it's the only thing that generates revenue for Hilo Town when you see outsiders going to Hilo in any number. Especially because by the 1990s, as the roads get better and people get more used to it, people drive their own cars from, for example, Kona or the Mauna Kea, and they go up to the volcano on their own. So you don't need Hilo anymore. Hilo's unnecessary. You fly into the Kailua Kona airport, which the state didn't want to build, but they had to because the private sector had generated so many resorts. And people are complaining so loudly that flying into Hilo and to go and then drive for a large part of a day on a dangerous road to get to your resort made absolutely no sense. So the state, kicking and screaming, had to build the Kailua Kona airport, which is now, of course, the major airport for the Big Island. So the state, as of 2020, still really doesn't like Kona and really wants Hilo to be the center. And it's, I think I mentioned last time, this is why Hilo that's why the big campus is in Hilo, not in Kona. It doesn't make any sense. It would make more sense for that campus to be in Kona side. But it's in Hilo because that's the state's view still in 2020, is that Hilo's the center where stuff should be. So I mean, there's almost schizophrenic. When you look at the Big Island, it's pretty weird in terms of the split of power and money. So the county government's all based in Hilo, but all the money is in the Kona side of the island in the private sector. Very different than Oahu or even the other islands in any way, shape, or form. What you still have is part of the empty land image. What's really sort of sad, but it's pretty surreal, and I hear a lot because my sister actually was the social worker for Ka'u in the Big Island. Is she actually was the single social worker for an area that's larger than the island of Oahu, which has, I believe, 14. She had a client list that was absolutely massive in terms of the number of people she had to deal with, and she was it. So she'd literally spend up to 6 hours a day just driving to talk to clients across that part of the island. The Big Island has the highest suicide rates in the Hawaiian Islands. It has the highest rate of unemployment, even more so than Molokai. Has the highest rate of non-marital births, which just means that what you end up as a single parent having to try to basically help, raise a kid on their own. All these are symptomatic of social dislocation and economic dislocation. Large parts of the Big Island are pretty grim when you actually go there. Pahoa is not exactly a place that you get a warm and fuzzy for if you actually start to look into how people are having to live there. And that's very typical a lot of the Big Island. Now, of course, this doesn't help tourism at all because large parts of the Big Island tourists feel uncomfortable. So they still sort of stay on the enclaves or stay on the Kona side of the island, just like enclaves like Kaanapali were. But if you go to Maui, for example, you don't have those type of sort of, off the chart parts of the island where there's communities where if you walk through there, you sort of wonder, am I welcome or not? Or, you're not sure if you should ask questions. The Big Island still has a fair amount of those. The Big Island still has a sense of it being the empty land. And that's actually reflected in the social issues and the psychological issues that you find in the Big Island that are much statistically higher than the other islands. And what you find and what she found as one of the folks working there, they still only have 3 social workers in the Big Island, or actually no, 4. 1 for Kona, 1 for Ka'u, 1 for Kohala, and then 1 for Hilo. And that tells you something right there, just that split in terms of space. Given the distance and the population, it's totally inadequate. The educational system has the same type of problems. You're just not going to get funding from DOE because it's the Big Island. So what you get is it's still, even in 2020, off the charts and largely of limited interest to the state of Hawaii. Not surprisingly with all this, what happens is by the 1990s, after Maui jumps on board this part-time resident thing, so you get the idea of basically taking agricultural land and turning it into residences for folks to have as vacation homes. Not surprising, the Big Island just totally jumps on this. I'm going to try to, I'll send you a link to a video, if I can, maybe a couple, to talk about this on the Big Island. But the Big Island is the second island that jumps on the part-time resident model. And that's simply because by the 1990s, you've got large parts of the island that are basically completely off the economic, system. They've vanished, especially the ranches. And there's an idea that for the ranch, the folks that might want to come and live part-time on the Big Island, maybe you can market that as sort of like a better weather version of Montana, versus, living on the coast. So what happens is they start marketing the Big Island fairly successfully, actually, in fact, quite successfully in Waimea, to part-time residents, with the idea that what you do is you own a house and you can come in November and you can ride your horse in Waimea town, and explore the countryside there. And so what you're sort of doing is you're marketing it as an alternative to, like, Texas or Wyoming or Montana. You don't market it as the way that you'd market a coastal resort. This is pretty much unique. Well, no, Maui does sort of the same thing, so it's not quite unique. But it's hugely successful on the Big Island and allows them basically to sort of reintroduce money into large parts of the islands that didn't have it. And so this becomes that. But if you think about, again, what I was mentioning just a second ago, when you've got the large part of the island really isn't bought in sort of the tourism experience, they don't really see themselves a part of it. If they have a hard time with a regular tourist, you can imagine the type of trouble they're going to have with someone who's a part-time resident. And so there's a fairly significant amount of conflict between part-time residents and locals. I see this most if you go down to Captain Cook, where we're working with one of the ranches down there, where there's a real sort of uncomfortable relationship between the folks that have moved in since the 1990s into a rural area, which is what Captain Cook is, and bought areas that were, for example, in coffee plantations and turned into really beautiful homes. But then living around them are still the folks that are making money off of coffee, which is entirely agricultural experience. These groups don't get along particularly well, and this is you see this a lot, ironically, in the Kailua Kona Walmart. In fact, shopping in general in Kailua Kona town is sort of an interesting experience if you watch the dynamics of the people there. I mentioned, oh wait, did I in this class? Yeah, I did talk about OTEC in this class. It sort of says something about the Big Island. Let's switch back over here. Again, because both the territory, and this actually is the territorial period. The territory is really, again, disinterested in the Big Island because it's just off the charts. And so what happens is the Big Island, when we start to get into electrical power in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Big Island had a number of small and a couple of middle-sized plantations up on this side of the island, up in here, in the Kohala coast section over to Hilo side. And so what happens is those plantations is, if you remember when I was talking about power generation, so the plantations are raising sugar. They cut the sugar, they throw the sugar into the mill, they burn the sugar residue, the sugar cane. That steam and heat that's generated off of that then goes up in the stacks. They put turbines in the stacks that generate electrical power. Their main business is making sugar, but they're also making electrical power just as a byproduct of the sugar production that drives the plantation. On the Big Island, because no one wanted to spend any money on anything, the Big Island basically becomes entirely dependent on sugar plantation generated electrical power. The Big Island County and the territory of Hawaii spend no money on making a power plant that actually is publicly owned. So there was no Big Island Power Company. And when the one starts up in the 1930s, all it is basically organizing the power coming from all the different mills. Now, this starts to be a problem even during World War II, because as with the other islands, the Big Island, becomes just covered in military. And the mills really can't expand the amount of power they're generating because they lose a lot of their workforce to the war, and a lot of the mills get shut down. So all of a sudden, the amount of power available is dropping. The need for it's expanding. Post World War II, most of the plantations don't go back into business. So I believe on the Big Island after World War II, you only had like 5 or 6 plantations instead of 14 or 20. So that means they basically have 5 or 6 little sort of power generation stations instead of 16 or 20. By the 1960s, they're down to 2. The last one was, you have to go take a look. I think it's one of the Kohala mills, but I don't remember the name of it. And then basically at that point, the state in a panic realizes that if that mill shuts down, the whole island's going to go dark. That they have no power generation. It's like being in parts of Micronesia in the 1970s. And so they absolutely panic. And they put a huge amount of money and basically pay the guys at the mill to run the mill for the sole purpose of generating power, just so the Hilo side doesn't go dark. The Kona side of the island already had their own portable or basically local power generators, just like the one we got above Sinclair Library. Or Sullivan Library. So what you get is the Big Island, basically the state subsidizes a plantation to basically take the sugar, flush the sugar in the Pacific Ocean, and generate power. So they turn them from a sugar plantation to basically sort of like a power generation plantation, I guess. That of course isn't going to work. The plantation shuts down anyways because they can't make enough money and the state decides it doesn't want to pay for it. At that point, the Big Island suddenly finds itself in a desperate need for power. They come up with a couple of sort of short-term solutions. What they also then jump on something that there was a lot of controversy then, and of course still is if you're familiar with that. And it's basically taking a look at the fact that you have this large number of volcanoes here. So notice how we're back to volcanoes again. With the idea that if you've got steam and all sorts of stuff coming up here, so it's obviously hot, then why don't you just drill a hole in the ground, push water or some sort of fluid into here, let Mother Nature heat it up for you so it comes back up as steam, and then you run turbines from it. So if you think of the old sugar plantation, you take sugar bagasse, which is the sugar cane, you throw it into a boiler, you heat it up, you burn it. The heat that you generate from that, you then spin your turbines in the power stack. They basically sort of use Mother Nature as the boiler. This is what we call geothermal. And so the idea is, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put a geothermal plants all through the Big Island, drill into the ground, and then tap this geothermal energy. And that way what you'll have is a hopefully non-polluting energy source that will solve all the energy problems for the Big Island, which is still critically short of energy in 2020, by the way. And so they put the first of these in, which they do an incredibly bad job of promoting, get everyone all hoo-hoo about it. And the end result is just a public relations nightmare, which is still going on. And that's the Puna geothermal plant. The state pushes it. The state wants it because the state doesn't want to spend any more money on the Big Island, per usual. The Puna geothermal company is sort of a strange operation run out of Texas, I believe. And so what you get is this facility, which is basically supposed to provide almost a third of the power from the Big Island. That originally we're going to be able, I believe, either 5 or 6, I've forgotten now. I think they're going to be 5 or 6 running all the way down here. They were basically going to provide all sorts of power for the Big Island. Now, in very typical state fashion, and I got drawn this because my dissertation was involved in this, what they decided was if you're generating all this power here for the Big Island, and you only need 2 of the power plants for the Big Island, what are you going to do with the other 3 or 4? And what they come up with, and you just sort of got to take this as a grain of salt. This is people not thinking very clearly, as far as I'm concerned, in my personal opinion, is you're going to take all that extra power you have here that you're now generating out of these huge geothermal plants. And what you're going to do in the same way that you do that, well, in the mainland, what you do is you have like Bonneville power dams. So you have these huge dams on rivers and they ship power all over the Pacific Northwest. In the same way, what you do is use all your power system here. And what you do is you ship that by huge power lines across the Big Island, under the water through the Maui Channel, across my part of Maui, southeast Maui, under the water, across Molokai, under the water to Honolulu, which needs the power. So what they do is they get Hawaiian Electric, which was then an Oahu power company, involved. They get an enormous amount of money because of our senior senator, Dan Inouye, literally billions of dollars to come up with how to move energy from the Big Island over to Oahu. By the time they actually get this to the point where they're the final planning, ironically, all but one of the power stations they were going to put up in the Big Island wasn't going to give any power to the Big Island or any of the islands in between. It was all going to go to Honolulu. One of the side effects of that is Hawaiian Electric then starts buying up the power system. So they buy the power companies on the other islands as part of this huge power transmission system. Enormous lawsuits all over the place. They were given a waiver. They didn't have to do any sort of environmental assessment in terms of what the impacts were going to be. So it's just, it's just an egregious example of government, if I want it, I'm going to do it type stuff, which we're pretty famous for here in Hawaii. The whole system, ironically, falls apart sort of based on two parts. One is they never had to do a complete environmental assessment of the one power plant they put in Puna. But when they start to put the other ones in, the federal government actually steps in and say, hey, wait a second. You guys are going to have to do that if you're going to put a bunch of power plants in here. Most importantly, what happened is a bunch of geologists then point out, which is ironic because if you think of the more recent situation, is that if you put the power plants along in here, you're putting them on the side of a rift zone. And if you remember back in 2018, the existing power plant got partially swallowed up. Ironically, the location of what would have been the other three major power plants would have completely disappeared under the Pu'u'ulai vent. So they would have lost all the power. They would have been swallowed up under lava. And they started to realize that, or geologists started to realize that when they actually started to do the final planning for building these things, is this area was so unstable that you were trying to build them in a place that was like, somewhere way beyond stupid. So that suddenly screeched to it. All of a sudden, that part of it screeched to a halt. And of course, if you didn't have the power generation happening here, then you really didn't have a lot of reason to run these huge power cables all the way to Oahu because there wasn't going to be anything in them. That project, terrifyingly enough, in 2020 is still active. DBED, the Department of Development Economic Planning, still has this as an active project. They're still soliciting extra federal funding, and they're still soliciting the development of 4 more geothermal wells in the Big Island to make this happen as we speak. So despite the fact that this just had everyone up in arms on 4 islands, the end result is it's still an active project 20-something years after it originally was thought of. Was it a bad idea when it thought of? It's an even worse idea now. So the Big Island ends up as center of this. It gives you some idea of the way the state sees the Big Island even in 2020, that they still see the Big Island as sort of a place off the chart that you can sort of do weird stuff at because, who cares? It's just the Big Island, And so this whole geothermal mess has gone through, I think, 6 different versions. But it's still active as of 2020. The EGA administration is actually sort of quietly pushing it because they see this as part of the state's self-sustaining, sort of sustainable energy production model. Yeah, it's a very strange thing. I'm not sure where you Google this, but people have written whole books on this. Or at least dissertations on this. About a third of my dissertations involved with this project because of the impacts it was going to have on the Maui. So that's sort of what we'll finish with this. Is sort of this becomes, if you want to, that's my stereotype of the Big Island. Even in the end of the 20th century and in the 21st century, you can still see the Big Island as a place you can pretty much do stuff that you would not think of doing on the other islands. You could put geothermal energy on Maui, and you could actually put geothermal energy here in Oahu. There's hot spots underneath Diamond Head. So theoretically, there's no reason you couldn't drill in Kaimo Key. If you drill down far enough, you'd find hot material, and you could do the same thing here. But people would never put up with it here. They would never put up with it on Maui. Big Island, oh yeah, it's just Pahoa, who cares? We can go put it there. So yeah, from an environmental standpoint, this is probably one of the fascinating discussions that have happened because this was entirely pushed by the public sector with Hawaiian Electric as the other big player in this, and the federal government pouring in billions of dollars over the years on this project for absolutely nothing. But a lot of people made money out of it at some point or sure. So that sort of contemporary urban legend, if you want to think of it that. Okay, with all that, I guess, are there any questions? We're all sort of set.
So our critical thinking too,
Yeah.
you still have a chance to do it?
Yeah, just get it to me by Monday. Yeah, the 12th.
By the end of Monday or before Monday?
No, by the end of Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, because the next one's doing the 16th. I would give you more time, but you don't want to have to try to get 2 of them done in a couple of days.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. So yeah. Just tell yourself you got to have it done by Monday afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? We all good on this stuff? Okay. If you're looking for a good critical thinking topic, different aspects of that whole power energy thing in the Big Island is, you know, there's been tons of stuff generated in that since that project's been around now for, crap, it's been around for 40 years, that project. Yeah. I mean, the Big Island's a really interesting island when you're looking at what happens when people see you as the back of beyond. And that's, you see that even, for example, with Mayor Kim's attitude towards the state and Governor Ige. Big Island state right now, as you remember this week, wants to open tourism. Big Island says, nah, we ain't doing it. It's very typical of county governments that if the state says something, as far as they're concerned, that's a wahoo talking. They don't see it as applying to them unless they feel like they want to. And if you notice, all the mayors have been really interesting. It's very interesting watching the different mayors, especially Kauai, who's actually a Chaminade grad, by the way, and the Big Island mayors reacting to the state as if they're like co-power groups. Theoretically, the counties have to do whatever the state tells them. But if you're on the other islands, I spent a fair amount of my life on the other islands, they do not see the state of Hawaii as reflecting the interest of anything other than the city of Honolulu. So you see that real consistently, and it's real interesting watching this whole COVID discussion, especially the reopening of tourism, and the counties basically saying, it's fine, you're the state, you can do it, but if anyone's going to land on my island, here's how we're doing it. And if you don't like it, then just go, fine, do your own thing, but don't bother us. You can see that, this whole thing's supposed to start on the 15th, which is next Thursday. It's this weekend's going to be really entertaining if you like to watch inter-office, inter-level politics and power dynamics played out, because it's going to get really ugly by Monday, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so I guess we're all set.